certainly tonight, we have got an exciting speaker, as I said. He is none other than Priyan, or we call him Max, my brother Max Jeganathan. He's an international speaker and is a director of Lifetalk-Faith, who is actually very passionate. He's very passionate about sharing the Christian viewpoint on current issues and life big questions. He's an international speaker, spoken on in banks, businesses, universities, political institutions, and many of these are not fly-by-night institutions. They are multinational companies like Facebook, Google, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse, Singapore Economic Development Board, and even Canada National Parliament, besides speaking at churches and conferences too. Now, Max is a Sri Lankan national, but he has grown up in, he has been raised in Australia when his family migrated over there in the 1980s. And one very interesting fact about Max, that he has been a lawyer and a political and policy advisor to the Australian Labor Party in the Australian National Parliament. And so, in fact, recently, I believe that he addressed the fellowship, the Christian fellowship in that same party recently. So he is a very interesting person with wide, very broad experience in politics. And he's currently even doing a PhD in law with special interest in relationships between faith, politics, public policy, economics, and moral reasoning. So without much further ado, may I invite Max Jeganathan, our esteemed speaker, who's logging in from Singapore, to give us his opinion on faith, politics, and flourishing. Over to you, Max.
Thank you so much, Sam Keong. Such a blessing and a privilege to be able to be here with all of you. Yes, thank you for that very kind introduction. And Sam Keong, what he didn't say is that he and I are old friends, and he's been a dear brother, a dear elder brother, and in many ways a teacher and a pastor, and much more than a friend over the years. So I'm really blessed to be able to speak to you all today. And yeah, he's absolutely right. I spoke to a group from the Australian Labor Party just a few weeks ago, but I got to be honest with you. At the moment, I'm finding Malaysian politics much more interesting, much more dynamic than Australian politics is. I usually keep my eye on about 5 or 6 different countries and their politics. And since your last federal election, Malaysia has been one of those countries. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about faith, politics, and flourishing. It's something that I think most people, most of the time, try and avoid because it just feels too messy or too sticky to have to deal with. So I'm glad that you are not amongst those people, that you are up for the discussion, that you are up for the issue, and that you are so committed and so devoted to seeing your country and your communities that make up your country become better places for people to grow up in. When I was working in professional politics, and I had the privilege of working in professional politics for about 8 years, and I often wonder whether I might get the chance to do it again one day. But during that time, I used to watch a TV show called The West Wing. And many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of it. If you haven't, please get a hold of it. Try and watch The West Wing. It is the best screenwriting and acting in television that I've ever come across. Anyway, I'm biased because I'm a former political advisor. But watching The West Wing while I was working in politics used to kind of motivate me and a lot of my friends and colleagues. We were kind of young at the time, like in our early 20s, mid 20s, and just getting started. And so The West Wing would really inspire us. We weren't as good looking or as intelligent as the characters from The West Wing, but the TV show depicts a fictional US White House. So it depicts a US presidency. And the writer of The West Wing, a guy called Aaron Sorkin, he basically used little bits and pieces from various American presidents from real life American history to invent this fictional president, Josiah Bartlet. And on the president's desk in The West Wing was something that Aaron Sorkin took from John F. Kennedy's desk, which President JFK actually had on his desk when he was president of the United States. And it was a small plaque that said, "The sea is so big, but my boat is so small. The sea is so big and my boat is so small." And I thought that was an incredible thing for a president to declare, especially the president of the United States, arguably one of the most powerful people on the planet, to acknowledge the weight and the pressure and the difficulties of the world around us that even a president has to navigate through, even someone with great political power. It doesn't matter how powerful you are. The sea out there is big, and it's messy, and it's stormy, and it's difficult. And even if you have immense power our boats ultimately can seem very, very small. Now, for all of us in our lives, doesn't matter what we do or who we are, I'm sure we can identify with that sentiment, that it seems more and more like the ocean out there and the storms out there are bigger and bigger and bigger. And our lives, our capacities, our resources, how we can actually impact on that storm seems smaller and smaller and smaller. And so in that context, in the midst of this kind of perpetual challenge of trying to make sense of politics, trying to make sense of faith, trying to make sense of the big questions of life, I want to talk to you all tonight about three aspects of the intersection between faith and politics. The first is our pursuit of a perfect world, our pursuit of a perfect world in the context of faith and politics. Secondly, our navigation of an uncertain world in the context of faith and politics. And thirdly, what is the key to building a better world in the context of faith and politics? So we pursue a perfect world, we need to navigate an uncertain world, and how do we build a better world? And how do each of these three categories find meaning, and how can we make sense of each of them in the context of this thing we call faith and this thing we call politics, right? So first of all, how do we build a perfect world? Or what does the pursuit of the perfect world look like? Well, this is the funny thing about politics. And I'm sure all of you, as people engaged with the issues, as people who are reading, who are watching the news, who are keeping in touch with what's happening, we all naturally have this human instinct to want things to get better. And I think that's a good thing. It's a very important thing. The problem we often have, though, is that we think, at least subconsciously, if not consciously, that politics is the way to build a perfect society, that politics is the answer, that once we get our politics right, everything will be okay. If only our politicians were the right kinds of people, or if only I was in one of those positions, I would know what to do and everything would be okay. Now, there's a famous writer by the name of Marilynne Robinson. She's a Christian. She happens to be a Christian, but she won a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Gilead, an amazing novel. And in that book, she says there are two realities that can be said of all of creation all of the time. My insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. My insufficiency to the world and the world's insufficiency to me. What's she saying? She's basically saying what we all know to be true if we stop and think about it. It doesn't matter how hard I work on myself or what I do. There's something deep down that doesn't feel quite right about me. At the same time, it doesn't matter how much I try and improve the world around me. There's always something not quite right about the world. There is a brokenness out there. And it is that brokenness that politicians, public servants, public policymakers, and ultimately voters and citizens are responsible for trying to deal with, the imperfection and brokenness of the world out there. And if we look at the basics of political philosophy, no matter what strand of political philosophy you look at, whether it's communism or capitalism or Marxism or feudalism or whatever it might be, there are, broadly speaking, four metrics that are used in political philosophy that all politicians all over the world, all of the time, if they are doing their job properly, are at least trying to optimize, right? And those four outcomes, sets of outcomes, are economic outcomes, education outcomes, health outcomes, and employment outcomes. So obviously there are some things that there are various subcategories to each of those, and there might be some other things you can add. But broadly speaking, when it comes to public policy, what we are really looking for as the final objectives are economic outcomes, good economic outcomes, good health outcomes, good employment outcomes, good economic outcomes, good health outcomes, good employment outcomes, and what's the fourth one I just said? And good employment outcomes. So we want people to have good jobs. We want people to be relatively healthy and have good healthcare. We want GDP to be good. We want our economies to be productive and to be working well with good infrastructure. And we want people to be living in societies where their quality of life is getting better from generation to generation with each of these four outcomes, right? So health, economic, employment outcomes. We want all of these things to be going into a better place. And through that, we seek to pursue ultimately what can be referred to as utopia. Every politician, when they run for election, they will paint a picture of a utopian society, which is basically the good place. Thomas More, when he wrote the book Utopia, when he coined the term, he wrote about it in the context of exactly that, a flourishing society, a good society, a society where people have their needs met, they can have their rights protected, they can have their dignity honored, they can raise families, they can be educated, they can have good health care, they can optimize their outcomes, their life, health, education, and employment outcomes. And so this idea of utopia is what everyone is talking about. And through all of history, every politician, particularly in democracies, when they're going for election, what they're basically saying is, vote for me and I will get you closer to utopia than my opponent. That's effectively what every politician is saying. Vote for me and I will get you closer to utopia than my opponent. And of course, every political system and every political strand of thinking and paradigm of thinking has different ways of getting to utopia, but everyone is trying to get us to utopia. Here's the problem, of course. No one's ever got there. There is simply no utopian society. We have no evidence of it. We've had now arguably 4 or 5 rounds of industrial revolution. We've had a computing revolution. We're in the middle of an information quantum computing and artificial intelligence revolution. We've had transportation revolutions. We are literally more academically, technologically, and educationally advanced than we have ever been before in human history. And that goes for Malaysia, it goes for Singapore, it actually goes for the collective humanity, if you like. And yet we still cannot achieve utopia. And on some of the deeper metrics, we basically haven't made any progress in the context of poverty, famine, divorce, mental ill health, anxiety, depression, social exclusion, discrimination, slavery, so many what we called in politics negative externalities, basically negative social ills, things that governments should be trying to get rid of, they're continuing to be there. So this search for utopia seems to be a bit of a fool's errand, where no one seems to be able to do it. And of course, we could use Malaysia as an example, but you can use any country as an example, Singapore as an example, Australia as an example, the United States as an example, Afghanistan as an example. Every society, when we look at the utopia that we want for people, every society has been a failed society since the beginning of humankind. How do we make sense of that? And how do we actually accept that when we think and expect so much from our political systems and from public policy full stop? Well, the first thing I think we need to do is accept that we should not be trying to pursue a perfect world. We should not be expecting that of ourselves, and we should not be expecting it of our politicians and our political systems and leaders either. Because as Marilyn Robinson said, there is always going to be some degree to which there is a brokenness or an imperfection in the world out there. And I think that is actually summarized and encapsulated beautifully when we think about the word utopia. Because when Thomas More wrote about it, he spelt the word utopia in the same way that you and I would spell it today. If I asked each of you to write down the word utopia, you would spell it like this: utopia. Utopia. Because that's how Thomas More spelt it. That's how it's always been spelt since then. But actually, the original spelling, the etymology of the word utopia is spelt with an E. EUTOPIA, like Europe, utopia, the good place. And here's something that's both fascinating and very funny, I think, is that the way we all spell it today and the way that Thomas More spelt it, he dropped the E. And when you drop the E, the meaning of the word completely changes. Because with an E, utopia means the good place or the perfect place or the place we're all looking to build. But when you take the E away and just have utopia, it actually literally means no place at all. So we are using a word utopia to try and get and build perfect societies, using politics, using government, using public policy. But little do we know that this thing we have got on a pedestal called utopia actually doesn't exist. And it's implicitly, emblematically, and symbolically evident in the word itself, no place at all. So if we think we're going to build the perfect society, we have to be upfront and honest, looking at the data, looking at the metrics around the world, that that's simply not going to happen. It's no place at all. So where does that leave us? If the pursuit of a perfect society has seen us fail again and again and again, what is left and what is next? Well, the first thing I think we have to do, having accepted that there are no perfect societies, is we have to work out how to navigate an uncertain world. Now, there was a sociologist called George Ritzer, and he talked about the 4 pillars of progress in society that everyone's looking for. And he called it McDonaldization. And he called it McDonaldization because he used the term when the fast food chain McDonald's was exploding in the 1950s and 60s. And McDonaldization is basically a term that George Ritzer used to describe what people expect now around the world in an advanced industrialized society. McDonaldization, right? Drive-through. Just give me my cheeseburger, give me my chocolate sundae, give me my iPhone, give me my Amazon, click and collect, give me my 2-hour delivery. This is what Ritzer was talking about. And he talked about efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. These are the 4 things we're all looking for. Efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control. And as a general rule, the more societies advance in the context of economics, in the context of healthcare, in the context of education and employment, those 4 things will increase as a general principle, right? Efficiency, predictability, calculability, and control will increase across the economy and across the society. The problem is all of society today, when we look at the 10 years ago and then 10 years before that and then 10 years before that, there is always intrinsic instability and volatility in the system. Now, you in Malaysia know this better than any other society, given what's been happening over the last 5 to 10 years in your country. But every country has that same level of vulnerability, that same level of volatility. It might be constructed in a different kind of narrative, but if you look at Hong Kong, you look at Japan, you look at Germany right now with the election there, you look at Australia right now with geopolitical tensions and the trade shocks that it's having to deal with. It doesn't matter who you are or where we are. All society all the time is deeply volatile. The economic theorists call it VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The world is always VUCA. It's always VUCA. So trying to predict it, trying to have this McDonaldization mindset where we can just drive up, drive in and get what we want and drive off, that's just unrealistic. It is an intrinsically uncertain and unstable world. So what we actually need to do is we need to find ways to anchor ourselves, to anchor our societies, to anchor our identities in the midst of the uncertainty. We need to find a way to anchor ourselves amidst the uncertainty. Why is that? Why do we have to find something beyond stability? Because if we look for our identity, if we look for our flourishing instability, if we look exclusively at those 4 metrics of political scientists and economists and public policy makers of doing well economically, doing well in healthcare, doing well in employment, like doing well in these primary public policy outcomes, one of 2 things is going to happen. And every society is a good example of it. And Malaysia, in my view, just like Australia and Singapore, has a combination of the 2. One thing that will happen is you won't quite get there. You won't quite attain that level of perfection. As we said, utopia. It won't quite be there. You won't quite be able to attain it because utopia is no place at all. But the other thing that can happen, and this is the more interesting one, is you do actually attain very high levels of life, health, education, and employment outcomes, but people still struggle. So the political system actually does deliver everything that we want from our politicians, and yet people still struggle. And countries like Singapore are a perfect example of this. Singapore has one of the highest GDPs per capita on the planet. We have one of the lowest rankings in the world when it comes to corruption. We have some of the most advanced infrastructure, railway lines, public transport systems, our educational infrastructure here, all incredible, right? It's a deeply advanced country. We have 2 sovereign wealth funds. And our 2 sovereign wealth funds are amongst the top 11 on the planet. And we're a tiny little country of 5.5 million people, right? So on any metric, Singapore's doing pretty well when it comes to the objectives of public policy. And yet, Singapore is amongst the highest, not just in Asia, but in the world, when it comes to suicide, when it comes to suicide attempts, when it comes to anxiety and depression, when it comes to social exclusion, when it comes to inequality. We're amongst the worst in Asia when it comes to social mobility, right? Domestic violence, domestic abuse, rape. These things are all horrific in Singapore, much worse than they are in many other countries that are much poorer. Now, what does all of this tell us? It tells us a couple of things. It firstly tells us that the objectives of politics and public policy are not enough in and of themselves. They are simply, and this is a definition I was given in high school, the objectives of good public policy are to promote and maintain the cohesional functioning of society. That's what good public policy is about, to promote and maintain the cohesive functioning of society. But what we see from the Singapore example that I just gave you is that that is not enough for people to flourish. People actually need more. They need more than good jobs and good health and good bank accounts. People are looking for meaning. They are looking for purpose. They are looking for strength in their relationships. They are looking for ideals. They're looking for friendships. They're looking for social inclusion. They're looking for a sense of belonging. They're looking for all of these deeper needs of the human heart that politics, no matter how well it is executed, simply cannot perform. So how do we then go about it? How do we then go about bringing faith to politics, bringing politics to faith? And how do we go about building societies where not just the political sector is flourishing and the economy is flourishing, but also the people are flourishing? I heard a great quote once that so many politicians and leaders of countries spend so much time trying to prepare prosperity for the people, they forget to prepare the people for prosperity. That is often evident in the political systems that I've seen and in the countries I've lived in. I was born in Sri Lanka. I grew up in Australia. I'm an Australian, as you can hear. I spent a couple of years living in the United Kingdom, and now I live in Singapore. And in all four of those countries, I see that. I see the limits of what public policy can actually deliver to a society. Right? So pursuing a perfect world is just not going to happen. We have to accept that. We do have to be ready to navigate an uncertain world. But even the difficulties there bring us back to this final thing. How can we build a better world together? How can we build a better world? And it begins with what I want to call first principles. What are the first principles, not just of our politics, not just of our public policy, but what are the first principles of our hearts and our minds that make us tick? And first principles, Aristotle defined metaphysics as first principles and first causes. And I think that's helpful. Metaphysics basically means anything that is not physics, anything that is not physical, anything that is beyond the physical, natural, material realm. So we're talking about all of those fundamental first principles that I've been talking about, meaning and purpose, values, right? What are the operating ideals on which a society runs? And what are the operating principles on which the individuals in each society run? What's in our heart? What makes us tick? What gives us a sense of who we are? It's these first principles that both demonstrate and symbolize the need for people of faith to be involved in politics. Because faith, by definition, brings first principles with it. Now, everyone has first principles. It's just that some people don't think about them. Everyone has first principles. Whatever you believe, and even if you believe in nothing, you've got first principles. Aldous Huxley put it really well when he said, you can't have no first principles. You can have good first principles and bad first principles, but no one has no first principles. The problem today is that too many political leaders and too many citizens, to be honest, think that they don't need first principles and don't bother thinking about them. And when you do that, when you neglect your first principles, it's kind of like your teeth, right? If you neglect to brush your teeth and say, I don't have teeth, I don't need teeth, well, it doesn't change the fact that you do have them. But what will happen if you neglect them is that you'll end up having very rotten teeth. So the thing about first principles is we need to think actively about them. We need to think actively about our first principles in order to build a better society and a better world and bring together the intersection between faith, politics, and flourishing. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, he's a former chief Jewish rabbi of the United Kingdom. He said, market economics and democracy are two of the great achievements. Market economics and democracy are two of our great achievements. But without a strong sense of identity and morality, they are useless. Without a strong sense of identity and morality, they are useless. And he's saying exactly what I just unpacked a little bit. He's saying we have to bring these first principles. We have to bring these sense of identity, sense of purpose, sense of morality to these great institutions: market economics, free markets, free societies, democracies, democratic representative government, elections. All of these things are simply institutions. They're useless unless the hearts and minds of the people have a strong sense of identity of who they are and have a strong moral framework. Otherwise, people are going to be trying to build better societies without the ideals inside. Now, we go back to Marilyn Robinson. She said the two things we know for sure are that I am insufficient to the world and the world is insufficient to me, right? So there's something not quite right about me and there's something not quite right about the world. The problem with most of us when we think about politics is we think the only thing to do for politics is to improve the world out there. And improving the world out there is important, but we can ignore the world in here, the disharmony in here. There is disharmony and brokenness out there, and there is disharmony and brokenness in here, in every human heart. And before we can reasonably tackle the disharmony out there, we first need to tackle the disharmony in here. Then the first principles that we have will be authentic, will be beautiful, will be powerful, and will be transformational when we try and take them into the political arena and just into the public square generally. We have to work out a way to deal with the disharmony in here. The problem with politics for far too long is that it's only pointing outwards. What's out there? Even when we criticize politically, we're always criticizing what's out there. No one says, here's the problem with politics, me. No one says that. Politics is all about the external problems. Well, first we have to look at the internal problems. And this is where the line by St. Augustine, one of the great Christian thinkers of history, is so helpful. He said, God made us for himself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in him. There it is. There's the answer to the internal disharmony, the internal brokenness, the internal struggle. And through the Christian message, what the Christian message actually offers is for God to step into an up-close and personal relationship with us through the person of Jesus Christ. And through that, to bring us rest and peace in here, to put an end to the brokenness in here. That then equips us to go and put an end to the brokenness out there. But for that to work, according to the Christian message at least, we have to channel that love, that transformational power, those first principles, those ideals of goodness and kindness and compassion and honesty. And once we have that being channeled out through us, being at peace inside here, then we are much better equipped to build a better society out there. We are much better placed to do that. Our first principles are locked. We have our foundations in place, and then we can strive with much more effectiveness for the life, health, education, and employment outcomes that we want for the people around us, and that we expect from our politicians too. But it's got to start first with each of us looking at ourselves. That's how we bring faith to politics and politics to faith and flourishing to both. We first have to look inside, then we have to look out. I'll wrap up now because I really want to take some of your questions, but I want to finish by just admitting to you that I told you one lie in my talk. Right at the beginning, I said that the plaque on JFK's desk said, "The sea is so big and my boat is so small." It wasn't a huge lie, but I wasn't completely truthful about the quote. It's actually not a quote, it's a prayer. And the whole plaque says, "Oh God, your sea is so big and my boat is so small." And when we look at the brokenness of society and the challenges that are faced in the political sphere, the sea will seem enormous, the storm will seem terrible, and it will actually seem insurmountable if it's just us and the storm. But if we think of it as God's storm, God's ocean, God's sea, and then we invite him into our boat with us, then suddenly it doesn't seem so bad. When we know that it's his sea and he's offering to step into our boat, it's a completely different picture. We can take rest, we can take confidence, we can take encouragement, we can innovate, we can contribute, we can vote, we can write letters to the editor, we can write blogs, we can share on social media, we can get active politically. And because we know that even though the sea is big and our boats are small, that it's his sea and he's in our boat with us. So wherever you are in your faith journey, if you're walking with this person, Jesus, that I've talked about, or you're wrestling with him, or you've never heard of him before, wherever you might be, I just encourage you to maybe take this day or this week to think through that, whether you're willing to let him step into your boat. That, in my view, is the best pathway to a transformational brand of flourishing through politics and public policy in the 21st century. Because Jesus offers the greatest blueprint for human flourishing, and he offers us the first principles through which to transform the societies in which we live. And so I really encourage you, if you're not fully connected to these guys at Workplace at the River, to do that. I think they're going to make that possible and give you guys some information on how you can connect with them. But I encourage you to do that and get on board. And and keep journeying and keep thinking and keep talking about these issues. I think they're very important, and there's no more important thing that a Christian or a non-Christian can do than to be compassionately and intelligently engaged in politics. Thanks for listening.
That's so true what you said, Max. Just the right people at the right place at the right time, just not there.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the wise insights that you have given to us tonight. Perhaps maybe just as a closing thought, maybe you might want to address this issue of brokenness in each one of us. Maybe do you have some wise advice to us regarding this brokenness, how we can overcome that, and as a result of it, become the good citizens that you were talking about?
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to do that. I will do that because I hope this session has been overall encouraging. I haven't tried to give any false optimism or false positivity. I've tried to be very straight and direct with you guys, but I do want to be encouraging, and I want you all to be encouraged that the brokenness that we all have to deal with, both inside here and outside there, I want to be very clear, through the person of Jesus Christ, we have exactly what we need to deal with both categories of brokenness, the brokenness that's in here and the brokenness that is out there. The problem with most free and democratic countries is that they think that the solution to the brokenness has to come from humanity itself, which actually misunderstands the brokenness. It's the brokenness that causes the problems. And so obviously the brokenness is not going to fix the problems. The problem has to come transcendentally. It has to come from outside the system. As is the case with everything. You talk to any good doctor about a disease, the intervention has to come from outside of the disease, has to come from outside of the patient, right? Yeah, no one operates on themselves. Even the best surgeons don't operate on themselves. And so similarly, we need surgery from outside of ourselves and outside of our system. It needs to be transcendent. We need transcendent surgery. And this is an overly simplistic way of saying it because there is much more to this point. But put simply, the love of Jesus Christ channeled in and through thinking, compassionate, responsible citizens out into their community necessarily will transform nations. It will transform nations in a way that brings flourishing both through the political and public policy spheres and through every other sphere too, through families, through schools, through universities, through education, through healthcare, through every aspect of a society, in a way that is qualitatively different to what humankind is actually capable of. So humankind identifies the correct things, but thinks that the problem is quantitative. We just need more love. We just need more compassion. We just need more trustworthiness. We just need more accountability. We just need more work ethic. And it says, let's go and just foster more of that. It thinks it's a quantitative problem. The problem is it's qualitative. The problem is that we are not capable in our own strength of what we need in order to fix ourselves and fix our societies. The solution has to come from outside of ourselves. Billy Graham had a meeting with President Dwight Eisenhower on his way to one of his crusades. And the president on Billy's way out of the White House said, "Good luck, Billy. I hope you have a great meeting. Wouldn't it be great if we all just learned to love each other again?" And Billy Graham smiled and he said, "Yes, Mr. President, it would. But we can only love in the purest sense if our hearts have first been transformed by the love of Jesus Christ." And the point that he makes there is that everyone agrees that this thing called love is important. That's not a Christian idea, right? Everyone agrees that love is important. The problem is the brand of love that we need in our societies, in our politics, in our media, in our government, in our private sector, in our public sector, the brand of love that we need is not a brand of love that we are capable of in our own strength. It has to come from outside of ourselves. And that is the love that Jesus brings. And he brings much more than that too. He brings a brand of compassion. He brings a brand of goodness, a brand of kindness, a brand of sacrifice, a brand of humility, a brand of joy, a brand of peace, a brand of rest. All of these things, every ideal that we are striving for in our own strength, Jesus brings it in a better way qualitatively, not quantitatively. And so that is the solution. Ultimately, the solution is the transformation of people by the love of Jesus Christ that can then go and transform their societies through the political systems. But we can't just sit in church and pray and sing and hope that everything gets better. We got to get out there and get our hands dirty. And we see this in a lot of the exilic literature in the Old Testament, particularly in Jeremiah and Isaiah, where God is saying, you need to work for the flourishing of your city, of your country, of your society, and for the people in that society who don't know God. You need to work for their flourishing too. That's why politics is important. That's why politics is as noble a profession for the Christian as being a pastor is. Because we are called to work for the flourishing of our communities, not just for the Christians. We're not tribes people. We're true citizens. And ultimately, when you look at the logical outworking of the love of Jesus Christ, it's the only way that anyone can embody that category of being a true citizen. So thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys. God bless you. And Sam Keong, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Max. Thank you. Thank you. May God bless you. There you have it, people. That while pastors work for the flourishing of the church or God's kingdom, the politicians with hearts that are transformed, that have been renewed by the love of Jesus Christ, works for the flourishing of the nation. There we go. So to answer the very first question we started with, well, can politics and faith mix? The answer is a resounding yes. The answer is a resounding yes, if it's done in the right spirit and done in the right manner. So thank you